Today, I'm walking through my full sourdough process from start to finish. I'll show you exactly what I look for at each stage so you can follow along and understand how the dough develops. Before mixing the dough, I check my starter. It should have doubled its size ideally, be bubbly, slightly domed, and smell mildly sweet and yeasty. When it reaches this stage, it's strong enough to rise the dough. Now I mix the flour, water, and starter together. At this stage, I'm not trying to develop strength yet. I simply mix until there are no dry patches of flour left and everything comes together into a rough dough. It usually looks a bit shaggy and uneven at this point, and that's completely normal. After mixing, I let the dough rest. This rest allows the flour to fully hydrate and gives the gluten a head start before we start strengthening the dough. Once the dough has rested, I add the salt. Salt strengthens the gluten and helps control fermentation, but adding it after the rest allows the dough to hydrate more easily first. After adding the salt, I begin strengthening the dough. To start building strength, I perform slap and folds on the bench. This helps the gluten network develop and allows the dough to begin holding structure. At first, the dough can feel sticky and loose, but after a few minutes, it usually becomes smoother and more elastic. You don't need to overdo this step, the goal is simply to start developing structure. After the dough rests again, I perform my first stretch and fold. This is a gentle way to continue strengthening the dough without aggressively mixing. I lift the dough, stretch it slightly, and fold it back onto itself. This helps align the gluten strands and gradually build structure. After another rest, I perform lamination. This step involves stretching the dough thinly across the bench and folding it back together. Lamination strengthens the dough and helps distribute fermentation evenly throughout the structure. It also helps me understand how strong the dough is becoming. Later in bulk fermentation, I switched to coil folds. These are gentler folds that help maintain the dough's strength without deflating the gas that has already been developed. At this point, the dough usually feels much more elastic and alive. You can often see bubbles forming under the surface. Bulk fermentation is one of the most important steps of sourdough baking. Instead of watching the clock too closely, I pay attention to the dough itself. I look for a noticeable increase in volume, a slight domed surface, visible bubbles, and I look for airy feeling and a jiggle when you move the container. These signs tell me that fermentation has developed enough gas and structure. Once bulk fermentation is complete, I turn the dough onto the bench and perform a gentle pre-shape. This step begins organizing the structure of the dough and prepares it for final shaping. After pre-shaping, I allow the dough to rest on the bench for a short period. This bench rest allows the gluten to relax, making it easier for final shaping. Now I perform the final shaping. The goal here is to create surface tension so the dough can hold its shape during proofing and baking. I gently tighten the outer surface while keeping the internal gas intact. This tension helps the loaf rise upward rather than spreading outward in the oven. After shaping, the dough goes into the banneton and then into the refrigerator overnight. Cold proofing slows fermentation and allows flavor to develop more deeply. It also firms up the dough, which makes scoring much easier the next day. The next day, I score the dough before baking. Scoring controls the bread's expansion in the oven. this bake, I use open baking with steam. The first 25 minutes are baked with steam, which allows the loaf to expand fully before the crust sets. After that, I continue baking for about 15 minutes without steam to allow the crust to develop color and texture. Once the loaf is baked, I let it cool completely before slicing. Cutting too early can compress the crumb and make it appear denser than it actually is. Every sourdough bake is slightly different. What I pay attention to most is how the dough behaves during fermentation and shaping. Those observations help me improve the next bake. Sourdough isn't really about perfection, it's about understanding how the dough responds over time. If you're new to sourdough baking, I share my process and small improvements from each bake here on Quiet Crumbs. You can subscribe and follow along as I continue to refine my techniques one loaf at a time. And if you're a bit more experienced at baking sourdough, I'd love to hear what stage you find the most challenging. Let me know in the comments.